Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to check out things, turn you on to concepts and theories and explications that you probably have never heard of before, but they would be impactful in your life if you did. And things that have been suppressed so that you don't know about them because they might threaten a certain group of entrenched, invested individuals. And this is our 280th Bible Decode, and we have been kind of going along with both the Roman origins hypothesis and also studies into the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in both of these cases, these are suppressed theories. There are literally about a dozen theorists at this point who are pushing the Roman origins hypothesis, but 99 out of 100 Christians have never heard of it before. And that is that the New Testament was actually written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation, a psyop against the Jews, who they had just gotten done fighting a war against, and who they had been fighting pretty much nonstop for the last 135 years. And they did it as a way to really mellow out the Jews, to tame or domesticate the Jews, one of their provinces in their giant empire. The Jews were the highest maintenance of all the people that lived in the Roman Empire. They were the hardest to manage because they believed that they were a separatist people and they were the chosen ones, and they were really into their rituals and their past, their history. And so they were willing to die to maintain their rituals and their belief systems. And the Romans really allowed you to be free as a religion. They allowed you to worship your own faith, but they wanted you to give a little bit to Caesar at the same time. And the Jews were just not willing to do that. The prime example is Emperor Caligula, who ruled the Roman Empire from 37 to 41 AD, trying to put a statue of himself in the Jewish temple, and that literally nearly caused a full-out war amongst the Jews, to the point where the Romans had to make an exception for the Jews. Like, we're putting a bust of Caesar in everybody's temple except the Jews. So the Jews had literally carved out an exception for their stridency in following their rituals. And the Jews were also waiting for a Messiah from all of the Old Testament scriptures that were prophesying a Messiah that was going to help them overthrow the colonial power, in this case the Romans, a military commander. And in fact, there were 3 self-proclaimed messiahs who did overthrow one of the Herods, which is, Herods were the puppet dynasty of rulers of Judea that were puppets of Rome. Herod the Great, and Herod Antipas, and Philip, and Herod Agrippa the first and the second. This was Herod Agrippa the second that was, forced to flee back to Rome as the Jews took over Jerusalem. And this caused Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian and his army, his legions. But it took the Romans 7 years to put down this revolt. And so this was the leaders of the revolt, really more than one of them, three of them at least, were people that believed that they were the Messiah, and that's what they were doing. So the Romans turned around and kind of took advantage of that idea, and they proposed in the Gospels, they proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, meaning pay your taxes, and who believed in walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression and recognizing the Roman centurion's slave owner as the greatest faith in all of Israel, while at the same time overturning the tables of the money changers who were Jews outside the inner court of the temple, so that they could buy small animals for the Jewish Passover, or the animal sacrifice. So Jesus is attacking the Jewish traditions and the Jewish rituals, and at the same time being totally deferential to the Romans. And then Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and even more castigating of the Jews, almost as if it had been written by the Romans themselves. And given that it was written in Greek, which is one of the two major languages that was used by the Romans, but not so much in Judea, where they spoke Aramaic, and very, very few of them knew how to read and write. And given that the Romans had a full monopoly over censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire, nobody was writing anything at this point in time without it being approved of by Caesar. And then when we get to the actual direct evidence, we have the Gospels and we have Josephus's War of the Jews, which admittedly is of Roman origin. Josephus was known as Flavius Josephus after the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. And he wrote a history in 7 volumes of this war, that Vespasian and his son Titus were the 2 main military commanders for the Romans, and they eventually became the 2 first Flavian emperors. And so this War of the Jews, the Flavian emperors were really the protagonists of the story. But if you read it, you can gradually recognize that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, at least the Synoptic Gospels. And the parallels between the two are really quite overwhelming and striking, and actually brilliant. There are some really well thought out and well disguised parallels between the two. If you look at the ministry of Jesus in Judea, according to the book of Luke, and then you look at the military campaign of Titus in War of the Jews, they are the same. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. In the same order, they encounter parallel events at each location that are separated by 40 years in time. Because the Flavians wrote the Gospels and they backdated the story by 40 years, 40 plus years. They backdated the story to the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius, which would be 28 or 29 AD. And, the War of the Jews was going on in the late 60s, early 70s AD. And so the story of Jesus is nothing but a replica of the story of Titus. And not only that, but the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament, including his major prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem being the sign of his second coming. These things are fulfilled. These prophecies were fulfilled mostly by Titus, including the destruction of Jerusalem. That was overseen by Titus. And so, according to both the Gospels and War of the Jews, Titus was the second coming of Jesus. And that was well known by theologians and historians all up until the 19th century. They recognized that Titus was the second coming of Jesus. It's right there in the text. You know, exactly what Jesus says is going to happen is exactly what Titus does. And, you know, people think that means that Jesus was a prophet and he was, you know, able to predict exactly what was going to happen. Maybe so, but what he predicted is that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. That's what the Romans did. They grafted themselves onto the Jewish tradition. And they used that same type of language. They used a ton of botanical language. They introduced this character named Pedanius, who is the father of not only homeopathy, but botany. And they used language like domestication and taming, pruning, and grafting. That's what they did. So it was a very big operation, okay? It wasn't like they just wrote all the Gospels, all the whole New Testament at once. It was like one book every few years. This whole operation went on for over 60 years. The book of Hebrews and Revelation, they weren't written until the 130s AD. So this was done by like a whole like dynastic family. It wasn't just, you know, a one-shot thing. This was a long-term operation by the Romans. Now, Michael Menescatz, in his book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, was able to find over 250 parallels between War of the Jews and the book of Luke. Just the book of Luke. 250 parallels just in Luke. That's 10 per chapter. Over 10 per chapter. And meaning that the parallels literally saturate the book of Luke. And many of them are quite impressive, where they have like almost a dozen, at least half a dozen themes or motifs that are in common in just a short amount of lines, just a few lines of text, and there's a bunch of commonalities between the two. But not only that, when you graph the parallels, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, it forms, 250 dots where every location of the parallels are. It forms 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, which is the emerging language of the Roman Caesars. Most of the Romans, especially the Caesars and the upper crust, they were bilingual in both Latin and Greek. And those letters are APTVS. So that also includes Titus and Vespasian. Basically, the idea is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their name to the book of Luke, so that we would one day discover it, as Michael Menescatz did. Now, when we take this Roman origins hypothesis like this, and what that means is that the New Testament is fiction, it's propaganda. And it also means that Josephus is also propaganda and can't be trusted. These are the two anchors of the first century for our understanding of what was going on in the first century. So this is really creates a vacuum of our understanding of the first century, regardless of how much damage it does to Christianity in general, and really to Roman history in general. And this vacuum can at least be partially filled by the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s and early 1950s in a series of caves near Qumran, which is about 20 miles from Jerusalem. Unfortunately, these documents, these scrolls, were of inestimable value, which included copies, and usually multiple copies, of every Old Testament book except for Esther, and many sectarian documents that were specific to this sect of monks that lived in this fortress at Qumran, one of the most inhospitable places on earth, at the lower altitude than Death Valley, and just right next to this sea that was also called Lake Asphaltitis, Asphalt Lake. Nothing grew there. The Dead Sea. It was utterly salty. It was a very hostile environment that they lived in. Total desert. Just imagine living in Death Valley. That they were living in worse conditions than that. And but they were very pious, strict monks, like ascetic, and they celibate. The only new people that came in were adopted children, and so they wrote a lot about their life and what was important to them, what they believed, and this is all the sectarian material that's very important and very explosive, and also sheds a lot of light on activities that were happening in the first century, including possibly the life of so-called Jesus, or just the life of messiahs in general in the first century. And also the problem was that these documents were eventually given custody to or taken in custody by these Dominican Catholic priests who must have seen something that they didn't like. Their job was to translate these documents and disseminate them to other theologians and scholars and the general public as fast as possible. And they did none of that. They would translate one slightly somewhat irrelevant document every couple years, but really they would kick the can down the road, and really like 40 years later they still hadn't published anything of substance. And it took people like Robert Eisenman to basically put their feet to the fire, force out some at least photographs of these documents. Many of them were in horrible shape, and you had to piece them together like a jigsaw puzzle. But some of them were more well preserved. Regardless, Eisenman, through legal action, was able to basically force the Dead Sea Scrolls to be published. Now we're reading one of his works that's called Zadokites, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. This is a pretty advanced text, probably for specialists, but we can glean a lot from this, especially as we approach trying to decode Bible verses, Bible books. We're going to start with the book of Luke here, coming up in a couple months. But one thing that Eisenman does make clear is that the terminology that's being used is sometimes masking, where one group calls a group of people one thing and another group calls them another thing. We have to be able to kind of play that shell game of names that and Eisenman does a lot to help us with that shell game of names that, who are we actually referring to here? If you look at, like, for example, in the book of Acts or in a lot of the Pauline epistles, they mention kind of all these names. And we generally pass over them if the name isn't Jesus or one of the apostles or one of the main apostles, just like really only Peter and John and Simon, Peter and John and James. We probably pass over it as just, this is just an also ran in this script. But some of these names are actually very important. A lot of them are Herods, meaning that they are, rulers. They're part of the dynasty of the puppet kings of Judea. And some of them are actually even Caesars or Flavians or, very powerful people that are, just hanging out with Paul. So this is kind of important stuff that most people don't pay too much attention to, but Eisenman does. Okay, we're going to just try a short section here of reading from this. So the Maccabees, just remember that's a dynasty of Jewish leaders, kings from the 2nd and 1st century BC that liberated Judea from the Greeks, but then were eventually taken over by the Romans. And the Zadokites go back to Zadok, the high priest of David or Solomon, from like the 10th or 11th century BC, but that also basically means righteous. And within the Dead Sea Scrolls is a narrative of this teacher of righteousness. The characters are the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. And the question is that Eisenman asked, and that Barbara Thiering asked, and some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls scholars ask, is who are these people in the Bible? Like, who is the teacher of righteousness? Who is the wicked priest, and who is the liar? Now, for Eisenman, the teacher of righteousness is James, the brother of Jesus. And for Barbara Thiering, the teacher of righteousness is John the Baptist. For many others, the teacher of righteousness is obviously Jesus. So these are things that kind of need to be sorted out, and this is Eisenman's attempt to do so here, or at least in part. Qumran can also be considered a training center for the Jerusalem priesthood, as the monastery is probably very near the site where Judas Maccabee, the son of the founder of the Maccabee dynasty, and his 9 Zadikim, or righteous ones, hid in caves. This is according to 2nd Maccabees, which is an apocryphal book that I think is actually in the Bible in some sects in the canon, but it's mostly apocryphal. One cannot resist the admittedly speculative suggestion that it might have been founded by John Hyrcanus, another Maccabee, to commemorate his return to the Sadducee party of his uncle. Now, last time he was delving into kind of separating these two different kinds of Sadducees. One is like a 1st century BC Sadducee, and one is a 1st century AD Sadducee. So his return, and so we're talking about 1st century BC stuff. So Sadducee party of his uncle, much as his father had embellished the family's ancestral tombs at Modein before him. It is not sectarian until it is rendered sectarian after the assumption of power by Herod in alliance with the Roman-inclined Pharisees. Josephus and priests like him, John the Baptist, for instance, probably went out to it for a 2 or 3 year novitiate period as young men let's like to be initiated as young men, where they were indoctrinated with Zadokite ideas. Now here Eisenman, is writing this in the late 80s, early 90s. He doesn't know anything about the Roman origins hypothesis, so he believes that people like Josephus actually existed, and that they can be trusted to at least a certain extent with their histories, and also John the Baptist. When you get into the Roman origin hypothesis, these people become fictional characters. So, Eisenman eventually did, I believe, warm up to the Roman origins hypothesis. As coin distribution testifies, it flourishes under the Maccabees, Zadokite ideas, meaning, and it is not inimical to them, though it is somewhat opposed to Phariseeism and any Pharisaic tendencies among them. It only begins to decline with the coming of the Romans under Pompey and the assumption of power by Herod the Great. So the Pompey thing, that's 63 BC. The assumption of power by Herod is 37 BC. So that's where we're talking about. The Nahum Pesher, and that's Pesher is like kind of a decoding system that particularly the rabbinical Jews used, using like kind of insider language and such like, to kind of be able to decode religious texts. Also referred to, though condemning crucifixion as any good messianic text would in this period, is not otherwise antagonistic to Alexander Jannaeus, another Maccabee, but rather to the presumable Pharisees he crucifies. The sectaries at Qumran knew their history as well as anyone else, in any event as well as Josephus, who may even have received some of his training with them. And this is just the point. The example of Alexander Jannaeus is cited for polemical purposes only, to condemn those who are guilty of having invited the Romans into the country in the first place, namely the Pharisees, as they had previously the Seleucids under Demetrius, and probably at the time of Judas Maccabee, to condemn the effects of this presence, that is, the crucifixion of the just, which the Romans indulged in so promiscuously. At this point, it is helpful to observe that the Damascus document, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents, actually prescribes death as the punishment for those, quote, whose sworn testimony has condemned another to be executed according to the laws of the Gentiles. It is also striking to see that the sectaries do not hesitate to call by name foreign opponents whose regimes are now regarded as past history, such as Demetrius, the king of the Greeks. It is another thing with regard to the present, when their peculiar and by now familiar code comes into play. As anyone familiar with the technique of literary criticism will immediately grasp, the thrust of this commentary actually relates to the 1st century CE, the period when the seekers after smooth things hold sway. Now, this is a term that is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls a lot, seekers after smooth things. These are Jews who kind of have gone away from the traditions, like the circumcision and the animal sacrifice, mainly because they're living in urban environments like Alexandria or Rome, where they can't really do it because the Romans are like in control. And so they are seen as being kind of less pious or Zadokite. As do most of the other Pesherim at Qumran. Its examples being provided by way of historical confirmation of the points it wishes to make. The Kittim, which is meaning foreigners, but it mainly refers to the Romans. Although I think it also referred to the Greeks at the time that the Greeks were in control of Judea. The Kittim, K-I-T-T-I-M, in the Nahum Pesher, as in Daniel 11:30, regardless of how the terminology might be used in any other literary work, specifically denotes the Romans, since these are portrayed not only as being distinct from the Greeks under Demetrius, but as having succeeded them. There is no doubt as to how and why the monastery was destroyed after the events depicted in the Nahum Pesher. It was destroyed in the struggle between Aristobulus/Antigonus and Hyrcanus/Herod, very probably by Herod himself. As governor of Galilee, he hunted down insurgent leaders like Hezekiah, who had the support of the Sadducee-dominated Sanhedrin. When he was able, he then turned on the Sanhedrin, killing all its members except for 2 Pharisees, Pollio and Samias, the latter having already recognized Herod's leadership potential after the Hezekiah affair. On his way towards his final assault on Jerusalem, Herod even stopped to brutally and mercilessly dispose of the Galileans of Sepphoris, who had fled to caves with all their families. In effect, this is the end of the first stage of the Zadokite movement. Its pious priests have been slaughtered on the Temple Mount by the Romans and their Pharisaic collaborators. Others fall victim to Herod's destruction of the Sanhedrin, and though the struggle is protracted, their fate is sealed with Herod's final assumption of power around 37 BC. In the course of these events, the monastery is burned and remains more or less uninhabited until the death of Herod, when his sons are too weak to prevent its rehabilitation. The earthquake of 31 BC was hardly of any consequence, except as a possible archaeological aid in helping to date the period of the monastery's destruction and relative dormancy. Okay, we're going to stop right there. That's interesting stuff. Now, you have to persevere with this stuff. Just get what you can. You're not going to get it all. We're just going over the surface of this anyway. We're not reading the footnotes. The footnotes constitute 2/3 of the material of this book. So maybe eventually we'll go over the footnotes, but right now we're sticking with this. Like, share, subscribe, and